Hi guys, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Andy Phillips. I lead the team at MacBroom. One of the things that stood out to me in the last few weeks is a number of enforcement actions that are coming out from the FCA. Generally, when that happens, a final notice is issued, and all of a sudden you see it reposted 100 times on LinkedIn from every consultancy, reposting it and saying, look at this, you shouldn't have done this, and we can help you not do this in the future. One of the things that I kind of get quite frustrated about is nobody gives anyone any practical insight. Nobody talks about an enforcement action. Nobody really shares what's actually happened, how firms have got themselves in this position, and what you could do to avoid it in future. So today I've invited our conduct and assurance team to come in, have a conversation with me about how firms get themselves into this position, how they can avoid it, and what they can do in future to make sure it doesn't happen again. So join me and the team, and I hope you enjoy the video. Thought it'd be good for us lot to have a chat. Given there's a lot of enforcement action at the minute, and it's kind of across the industry, a lot of it's centred on financial difficulty, whether you call that VINDIFs, collections, arrears, debt management, whatever you might want to brand it up as. And it seems to me that everybody kind of jumps on the bandwagon. So when there's an FCA enforcement notice issued, you get across the industry the usual suspects saying, look at this final notice from the FCA, watch out, all you naughty firms, you should be doing this, this, and this. And generally, there's no real analysis in it. There's no real insight for firms across the industry. It's kind of look at the final notice and just do what it says, which isn't helpful. Or you get the firms that are actually involved who can't really say because they've been involved and there's commercial sensitivity to it. So you never really get the actual insight from anyone because those who can say aren't allowed to say. So all you get is the commentary from those who don't know. And I thought it'd be good for us to kind of sit down because between us, so I've done 6 FCA enforcement actions at different kind of phases, some from inside the tent, some as a consultant, and also helped probably 6 to 8 other firms avoid that. You've done 2 that I'm aware of.
At least 2.
At least 2. You've done
5.
And Jamie, you've done 2 big ones.
Yeah.
Between us, we've done a significant amount of work in this space. I thought it'd be good for us to kind of have a chat and just set out practically, first of all, how do firms get into this position? Second, how can they avoid that moving forward? Third, what's it like to be put into a Section 166 to kind of have enforcement? What does working with a skilled person look like? And then finally, how do you come out of it, right? Because there's always remediation actions attached to this kind of stuff. How do you get from your first kind of interaction with the FCA where things are flagged up as maybe not being great to we've now executed everything we need to execute and we're done? So there's no rhyme or reason to this conversation. It'll probably just flow. The bit that stands out for me, the first lender to be fined was in 2014. So I worked on that program. That's a decade ago now. And yet big firms are still being pulled up by the FCA for poor treatment of customers. So I can't remember where it was that we had this conversation, but the FCA have been very clear with people in the past. You can't not know. We've been doing this since 2014, so you can't not know our expectations because we've published now innumerable final notices, issued fines and penalties, remediation programs. So I'm interested first in your views on how do people still find themselves in this position? And we're talking kind of reputable firms like the news out today. These aren't small businesses. They're reputable, trusted, financial services companies. So in your opinions, why are we still finding the same problems across the industry?
So I'll go first. I think in fairness to the firms, to give a little bit of credit, if you look at a lot of the recent announcements, they are actually relating to periods prior to, in many cases, the last few years. The one today was relatively recent, but prior to that, they go back a little way. It takes the regulator and skilled firms time to get to that point where they've made their decisions and got through the process. And very often we're reading quite a historic document. And if you think about vulnerability legislation changes in 2021, if you think about consumer duty earlier this year for stage 2, but last year for stage 1, I think that's caught firms out. and we've known it's coming, but haven't really known the details and haven't been able to move quickly enough to get themselves in the right position. So I think what we are seeing in some of the more recent ones, sure, there would have been some learns from the old ones as well, but there's some newer stuff coming into play that firms haven't been able to get to grips with as quickly as possible, as quickly as they want to.
Yeah, that's fair. Consumer duty is an interesting dynamic, though, isn't it? Because that body of work was born out of maybe 5 or 6 years of enforcement in this space. And the FCA had said that a lot of the work that they'd done in enforcing on the bigger firms in the collections financial difficulty space informed the consumer duty rules.
Yep.
So I suppose what you're taking is the learnings from the big firms and then transposing them across the whole industry.
Yep.
So I get your point entirely.
I find it quite fascinating in a way, taking on your point that the vast majority we've seen recently are historic. But taking your point, a lot of them are, in terms of the number of enforcement notices that are publicly available, the good and poor practices that have been up, the various iterations of those that have come out. You'll never know, I don't think, in terms of what happens internally, why they get into the situations they do. I think there are probably some logical reasons why they might do, whether it's changing leadership in terms of different direction, different strategic aims and goals, cost challenges, those sorts of things. But I struggle with it a little bit in terms of how did they actually get into that position. Over the years, again, against the backdrop of this, this historic lens that they generally viewed through, just in terms of the amount of information that's out there that's not even, that is publicly available to say, actually, here's what to do, here's good practice, and here is poor practice. Don't do the poor practice stuff and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
That's the bit I suppose, and without that knowledge of the inner workings of an organisation, I think that's a really difficult one to answer. As you said, the most recent one today is it's very recent. So you look at that and go, yeah, there's definitely some things, lessons learned on that one for the organisation. And I think the one for me today was more interesting on the basis of how quick the turnaround is, because to your point, the process from start to finish is so long-winded in terms of it's a long process to go through internally that agreement, right? What's the enforcement going to be? Is there a discount? Getting all of that agreed. Then the publication is almost the end point after that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to unpack in it.
I think one of the themes that seems to come through in almost everyone you read is that, irrespective of whether it was 10 years ago or even earlier this year and a bit of last year, that the fundamental thing that firms don't seem to get right is communicating with their customers either appropriately or in sufficient volume to be able to understand their needs.
Yeah.
And it comes through time and time again. The number of times you read didn't contact the customer appropriately, sent incorrect information or misleading information, didn't contact at all in some cases. And it strikes me that firms very often produce and develop what they think are very, very good internal processes, and they work very well from an internal perspective, but they don't necessarily have that customer lens.
Yeah.
And therefore, later on down the line, it causes problems.
I think there's a key phrase that you've seen a lot of the enforcement, it's tailored communication, isn't it? I think there's the general, historically, the ones I've been involved in, the strategies have fit kind of probably 70-80% of your customer population. And where they failed are those kind of, those tricky cases or the vulnerable cases or the ones where actually it doesn't quite fit your standard process.
Well, they try to use the one size fits all, and it doesn't. I mean, we've seen it all over the place. The key is to establishing the individual customer circumstances and making the treatment right for that individual, not because your manual says it, not because your policy says it, but it's because it's the right thing to do for that customer.
Yeah.
There's a line though in there. So I entirely get what you're saying. Where we've seen some of the biggest challenges is where firms have gone too far the other way. Right? So think about the public notice for example, which very clearly said in their policy document, we will communicate with our customers in this format during this period, and then failed to do so. That's probably an example of the other end of it, which is trying to over-tailor. So if you kind of do the broad brush, one size fits all, this will catch 80% of our customers and we can kind of streamline it through this channel, that's fine. But if you then flip the other way and you say, actually, we are going to do a bespoke, tailored approach. We're going to engage with everyone individually. We're going to understand everyone's individual needs. You never actually get anything done because you've created a new process for every single customer. So commercially, from a business perspective, you can't operate that.
No, you
tie
can't.
yourself up in knots trying to do so.
Yeah, and we know probably on average, true bespoke is probably about only 5% of your population.
Yeah. And it's how you identify that 5% and then give them the bespoke treatment.
Yeah.
That's the key, not just pushing everyone one direction.
And I think in a lot of the smaller firms, it's quite difficult because actually what you really need in those circumstances, you need a higher level of competence with your people that are dealing with those people, the ability to, well, not only understand the circumstances and understand what is needed, but also have the authority to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a difficult thing to achieve if you have a relatively small firm with a relatively small number of people trying to deal with all of your customers. You really should have a specialist team to deal with that, and that would make life much easier. Easier said than done, particularly easier in the larger firms perhaps. Hard for some of the smaller ones.
So let's start at the top because we've gone straight in for the detail. What makes a good financial difficulty operation, top to bottom?
I think very clearly written, plain simple English policies and processes for the colleagues to follow. So when a customer phones up, they know exactly what they should be doing, and it should be very customer-centric.
Yep.
All about finding out before you even start considering what the options might be. That has to be right at the start. Any customer conversation, find out all about it.
So one of the things we've seen, and you'll have seen a number of times, is that policy and framework documentation. That's kind of the first level. First of all, a disconnect between kind of governance, senior leadership governance, and understanding of that policy and ownership. The second is confusing policy, strategy, and standards. I would say that's one of the most common failings we've seen, where people say, oh, we've got a policy, but the policy either has nothing in it and it's not a policy at all, or it has way too much in it and it goes down to the minutiae of, we'll do this at this point with this customer and then execute this. So I would say the most successful firms that we've seen, particularly those firms who've maybe been on the edge of an enforcement action and managed to pull away from it, are those firms who can really articulate, this is our firm's policy. This is how we will then execute that policy in two separate threads of documentation. And here is the standardized set of processes that our colleagues can follow and understand. And that, for me, has been kind of where you've got those three things, that's where we see the most success. The minute those three things become blended into one, or they're open to interpretation at different levels of the organization, you just create that maelstrom of confusion and nobody can then get anything done. And you end up with your really senior team being engaged with operational at level 3, level 4 processes, rather than understanding at an outcomes kind of conduct risk dashboard level what impact they're having on customers.
Yeah.
I'll add to that. I think one of the key things is really simple, clear communication to your customers that they can understand, be it verbal or be it written. Don't confuse people.
That's a good point. There's plenty of literature around and evidence that suggests the average reading age in the UK is somewhere around about 11.
Is that true?
That's true.
Is it?
The average reading age is somewhere around about 11. So when you're
writing policies like an 11-year-old can understand it, basically.
and so if you think about it, trying to communicate with customers, it's all very well if if you're working in a financial organisation, if you've had a career in financial services, you probably have a slightly higher reading age, I would suggest, in most cases. Not all,
Some
from
cases.
experiences. But when you're communicating with customers, there's a large number of people out there who, particularly from a financial perspective, would be illiterate, financially illiterate, for sure, and that could translate into their reading age as well. So trying to design simple communications is really important, not to put in all the waffle and the jargon, but to get the messages across. And so you've got this dilemma of regulations say I must include this information, but how do I get that across in a way that my customers will understand it?
Yeah. You touched on another good point there as well, which is it's the tie to the regulation. So again, the things that we've seen be really successful, and I can remember, I'm sure it was you that actually built one of these, so the regulatory footprint. Nick, you've definitely done it.
Yeah.
Where you've tied back your policy, your operational standards, your processes back to that regulatory footprint. And that generally proves successful because you're able to say, we've done this links to MCOB or CONC or DIS or whatever it might be.
And that
when
links
you
to
can
your
evidence.
outcome testing scripts as
Exactly.
well.
But again, where we've seen policies and documentation written at the top, which is generally not casting aspersions on lawyers, but where they're written by lawyers, you get, we do this because Prin 6 says this. So that you're kind of adopting the letter of the law or the letter of the regulation rather than the spirit of the regulation. And again, those firms that we've seen either really quickly resolve their enforcement actions or avoid them entirely have fully adopted the spirit of the regulation rather than just, it says this, we do this.
Yeah, I think you've got
Bringing on the desk.
Yeah, sorry. I think you've got to be able to translate that policy statement at a top level down, all the way down to your advisor on the front line, that they understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Just that simple.
Yeah.
To your point in terms of that, making it simple, not just for your customers, but for your frontline colleagues as well, so they understand what they're doing and why. You can therefore challenge it as well to understand, right, this customer's circumstances are slightly different here. So I understand the spirit of what I'm meant to be doing. I can therefore challenge it or raise that question. I think when those firms that get that bit right, you've seen it, like I say, they go through that process a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Or the avoiding entirely.
Yeah.
And not only do they get the process right, they get the training right as well.
Yeah.
For the frontline colleagues, because it's and I think it's one of the hardest jobs in the world for a collections agent.
100%.
You know, I couldn't do it.
Particularly for the salary levels,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
the
yeah.
collections people, or financial difficulty people, are expected to operate at customer service level salaries, generally, not always, but generally, but expected to do the level of job of a quasi-counsellor, debt manager,
Yeah.
100% committed service provider. Almost impossible on a day-to-day basis, and you've only got to listen to some of those conversations. And if there's anybody senior out there that hasn't listened to their own team's collections calls, go and listen
That
to
should be
some,
mandatory.
because some of them are heartbreaking through to ridiculous. And the stories that you hear, we between us will have listened to thousands of calls, and you go from the examples of clearly this this customer's trying it on, through to I actually want to go and find this customer and help them myself personally because they're in such a bad position that we've got to do something individual for them. So go and do that. I would 100% say that if you're interested in how your team is offering or what your team is offering to customers in financial difficulty, go and listen and generally contextualize it with how would you feel, or if that was your nan or if that was your wife or your child ringing up, how would you feel?
Yeah.
And I think that just to build on that, I think it's that as soon as you add the human element into any sort of written document, policy or process, it can break it straight away.
Yeah.
It can, in terms, like I say, you see a lot of the scenarios where they are genuinely heartbreaking cases that can be resolved or kind of be supported there and then, and they're just not picked up on at all. That's what you find because there may be a rigid policy or process behind it.
And going back to your question about what is essential, kind of linking to this point with good people, well trained, you have to have appropriate systems that work and enable those people to understand what's going on. Many of the collections journeys, they're not one-hit wonders. They're not a quick conversation with a customer, put an arrangement in place and you never speak with them again. Generally, you'll find it's numerous conversations, multiple conversations over many months sometimes, and therefore you can have a different advisor each time. They need to be able to quickly understand what's been said before, what's gone on before. They need access to information. And the number of times firms don't have suitable income and expenditure documents in place, for example, that can be quickly called up and amended and updated on a regular basis, that makes the job even harder for a customer services advisor.
Yeah, 100%. Shall we, at risk of getting ourselves drubbed out of the secret circle of consultancies, shall we? It's a good line. Shall write that down. We can talk about some of the common failings, right? Because most consultancies would come in and say, "Oh, we can give you the secret formula," but fundamentally, there isn't a formula.
Yeah.
The most common failures, and you've touched on a few there. So I'll from my experience, poor policy, poor documentation, not easily understood by the workforce, not easily communicated to customers. We've covered all those off already. Insufficient or over contact attempts. I'll reword that. Insufficient or excessive contact attempts, either end of the spectrum. Providing incorrect information to customers. Failing to identify vulnerable customers. Failure to understand customer affordability via an I&E. What else have we
Insufficient
got?
questioning.
Insufficient questioning.
Not carrying out promised actions,
Yeah.
which then cause further harm.
I mean, they're all pretty standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they if you put every enforcement action side by side, every final notice, I reckon you get at least a 75% hit rate on all of those. They all generally have the same kind of thread, don't they?
Well, they have, because we've done those read across when we from our experience of what we've seen called out, in enforcement. We've done the read across from firm to firm to firm to firm, and there's probably an 80-20 overlap
Yeah.
on that.
There is, you always get the odd ones, though, don't you? At a very
Quirky.
specific level, the quirky ones. Deceased customers is always an interesting one. If you got the right the right process for deceased customers in place. We've seen all sorts of weird little quirky ones, but the bulk of it is those kind of, those are the key. The final one, which we've not covered, is around monitoring. Because the monitoring bit under consumer duty and before that is probably the most critical component, because it not only feeds the top, so how are you operating day to day, what do you change, how do you improve your outcomes for customers, it also allows you to report the bottom, right? So you can say to the FCA, we have X percentage fair or unfair outcomes, or detriment, no detriment, harm or no harm, whichever language people are familiar with. The inability of firms to put together a narrative in that space, I still find baffling. Even now, we're talking to firms actively as we speak who don't have outcome testing in place, who don't really understand it. They think outcome testing is an interaction rather than an outcome over a defined period or a journey. And the biggest thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about is the independence of the people doing that testing, because it's something that we've seen and we've seen at different places. We'll come on to culture in a minute, but from an integrity perspective with the regulator, if you have a level of independence from your first line, who are generally performing your outcome testing, to the people who own the operational execution, it stands you in such stronger position than if you're the SMF or MRT owning operations, you're owning collections operations, and you're also marking your own homework by owning the outcome testing. You're instantly in a weak position, right? You're instantly more fallible than if you've got an independent risk director owning it, or a kind of an external party doing it. It's different if you get to second line, because generally second line, you've got different reporting lines anyway. But that first line in particular, the number of examples we've seen inside and outside of enforcement, where you kind of get the outcome testing framework designed and agreed and implemented, and then it's owned by the same person who's owning the operational performance. And then you get, are we sure that's unfair? Should we be doing something different with that? Like, is it borderline? Is it a borderline case?
I've had loads of Barneys with you on that.
A lot of it is very, very well-meaning, right? But you open the door to interpretation, and the minute you see it in all sorts of walks of life, from legal to politics to banking. The minute you can be accused of marking your own homework, you've had it. You lose credibility, and you don't have that independent voice saying, we've validated that happens, it happens in this, on this frequency, it's delivered with this level of performance. So that for me is a massive thing. I mean, you've got loads of experience in that space.
Yeah, I mean, across various places over the years, and I think I've probably seen everything from what you've just described, where the same individual literally owns the outcome testing, as well as the delivery of the performance. And so, of course, ultimately it goes to one person. Nobody wants to deliver bad news to their boss typically. So, there is that conflict, because generally the person doing that assurance, if you're going into the same line, will be more junior and will probably struggle to have that difficult conversation. So that makes it tricky. And I've seen it through to the complete independent side, which again, doesn't come without its challenges. Just because it's independent doesn't mean, you can always kind of get your point across in a way that lands with the business. It still presents some difficulties and challenges. But generally what you do see is that you do have an agenda for change that comes from independent outcome testing, and you get more done in that sense. All you have to do is look at the results of, for example, QC or QA work that's done in the line, often by team leaders, and see how many times people pass their training and competency scheme thresholds at 90-something%, and say, it's a fantastic, things are going really, really well. And look at some independent outcome testing that shows you the results might be at 75 or 80%. So why is there that difference? And you just have to ask yourself that question. The answer's pretty obvious.
Yeah, totally agree.
Don't forget the near misses.
Near
Your
misses,
favourite?
pass with learnings.
The level of unfair treatment or poor treatment with detriment that we've experienced that would trigger some kind of regulatory intervention. So again, being drummed out the secret circle. Generally, anything between 10 and 20% unfair outcomes. Broadly, we would say the FCA probably won't clamp down on that. They work with you to try and improve it. You might get put under some kind of RMP or some kind of voluntary program. But generally, you'll be all right with that for a period of time. The worst that we've seen is, I think, 86% unfair was the worst that I've seen over a decent sample size of about 100 cases.
Yeah, and there was one that was also really, I mean, he's touching on 100%, but it was on a specific risk-based cohort that was being tested, which sparked a whole host of things off.
Some of that, though, especially when you get into risk-based cohorts, some of it is the design of the test, right? So you bring up an interesting point. General outcome testing across a broad sample population, you would expect to see primarily good outcomes. Yeah, you get the odd one where you pick it out, it's an exception to the process, or somebody's gone outside of what they should have done, and that creates the unfair outcome. Or circumstances of the customer create a situation that your process can't deal with, and then you get an unfair outcome. When you're doing risk-based testing, you're actively hunting unfair outcomes. So you're designing the test.
Yeah.
Well, not trying to point score. That's 1-0.
It's unusual.
It is. But you're designing the test in that way, aren't you? So you're trying to shape up. We're actively looking for signs of missed vulnerability. So you go hunting for that. And don't be surprised when you find what you're hunting for. Whereas if you put the question in the other way around, you probably wouldn't, if that makes sense. So there's different levels. But in general outcome testing terms, across a general population, you'd probably only be looking at, I would say, 30 to 35% gets you on the FCA, like really on the radar for a sustained period. If it's 1 month where you have a particularly high spike of unfair outcomes and you can explain the narrative, even if it's 2 or 3 months and you can provide a really good narrative about why that's happening, maybe you've changed the system and something's gone out of kilter, or you're putting a new training package in and you've got to give advisors time to get used to it. But that level over a sustained period, 30 to 35% over 6 months, 12 months is going to get you in hot water.
Yeah.
And anything above that is just unacceptable. Like to be fair to the regulator, they've really clamped down. So I've been doing this or more surrounding work for 12 years, 13 years. The stuff that firms could get away with back in the day to now is next level. Like, it's unbelievable. They've really clamped down on it. Yeah. You guys have seen this probably more day to day than I have.
Yeah, I think everything you've said there is right. I think it will depend on what your outcomes actually mean, and I could go on forever about this stuff, as you know, so I'm not going to do that here. But I think if you are talking about unfairness or harm, detriment, whatever you want to call it, however you want to say it, poor outcome for a customer, and there's a level of detriment associated with that, whether it be financial, that's probably at the upper end of what the regulator would be interested in, but any other form of detriment that you can talk to, I think that's where they become very interested. If you're a firm that classes internal policy breaches or internal process failures as part of your unfair cohort, well, sometimes that may not have any customer impact at all. So therefore I think you have to be really, really clear what you're talking about. So if some of those cases where you're seeing 50% of our cases don't hit our internal benchmark for processing, but actually when you look at the unfairness from a customer perspective, it's 7 or 8%, that's actually not a bad result. Other firms might be broadcasting 85%. That looks really good, but actually the 15% has detriment, and that's not as good as the other firms. So I think there will be a close lens applied to how you're doing your testing. But that said, wherever there's some kind of detriment, it doesn't have to be financial, then the regulator certainly is very interested. And probably more so these days. I don't think it was a case of getting away with stuff in the past. I think it was just the regulations said one thing and firms could do that, and that was considered acceptable. Many, many years ago it was acceptable not to drive without a seatbelt. Obviously you guys being so young wouldn't remember that, but I do.
I think it's also key as well to point out that a good outcome doesn't necessarily mean that the customer is happy. It's about doing the right thing for that customer.
Let's explore that, because that's a really interesting thread, and we've seen that. I can't name names.
No,
without
no,
hitting the buzzer.
bleep bleep.
But particularly the firms with high customer satisfaction generally hold that up as a shield. So if they've got high CSAT ratings or NPS scores, they'll say, look, our customers are delighted with what we do, and then are amazed when the FCA have been in and said, well, you shouldn't be doing that, and that, or this customer clearly had signs of this and you've not taken action. So explore that. Why do you think that happens as a rationale?
If you're thinking about over forbearance, for example, firms or actual frontline teams might think they're being fair, giving somebody a chance, prolonging it. And actually, that's not always the case, because, we've seen things where the interest just accrues, properties devalue, the equity is diminishing, and sometimes it would have been right to do it sooner.
Do you think there's a few things for me. There's a training element and kind of the so what question in terms of experience versus outcome. So have I had a great experience? Yes, but I had an abysmal outcome, which means I'm going to suffer detriment at some point. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about a bit earlier around the understanding of policy. So when we say this is what we mean by an outcome, so I think some of that for me, has got to be about the understanding and the deployment of that policy and the translation of that into the guidance, the standards around what we mean by. So if you're, we've seen it before, haven't we? In the when the FCA are at that point where they're coming in, or it's a skilled person on behalf of the FCA, they'll just go around and talk to some of the customer advisors, say, talk to me about what your understanding of this is, and then a lot of it will come out. Well, actually, it's they can't differentiate between experience. I'm broad brushing here, but you can't differentiate between a good experience and a good outcome, because they're very different things, or they can be at the opposite end. Yeah, on extreme cases.
And to your question, why would a customer say they're very, very happy? They may not have been given all of the facts. Yeah. So actually, they may be very happy in terms of what they ended up with, believing that was the best of what was available. But if there were 2 or 3 other avenues available to the advisor, but they didn't discuss them, they didn't divulge the information, or indeed they didn't divulge all of the associated information with the result that came. So, for example, a lot of people don't discuss the impact on credit files, and that's important to customers. There may have been an option that protects the customer credit file in a better way. So if a customer is unaware, they're not getting all of the information, then they might well think they're getting the best outcome available, hence I'm as satisfied as I can be. Yeah. And again, time and time again, you read lack of information, inconsistent information, unclear information, which means the customer doesn't always have everything they need to make the decision.
Yeah. Then that's supported by generally, customers who are held up as they're happy is because action's being delayed, right? And that supports your point there around, if they knew the wider impact, maybe they wouldn't be so happy about action being delayed. Or maybe we take the view of, we'll speak to you again in another month or in another 3 months, and we'll kick the can down the road a little bit. So I think she just made a good point there about skilled person, and a skilled person coming in and talking to colleagues. It's worth us talking about that as a topic. So I know we're darting around, we'll piece it together. The selection of a skilled person, I think, is really important.
Yep.
Having been on kind of both the company side of the fence, working in a role with a business that's appointing a skilled person, and also then being a consultant, either working under a skilled person or in support of the skilled person activities. If you get the right skilled person, it doesn't make life easy, because they're there to give you a hard time, right? They're there to make sure that you're credible, you've got everything in place, and they thoroughly assess you. But you in my experience, you only get 2 kinds of skilled persons: the people who want to work with you for the best end outcome, and the people who don't really understand the subject matter, in which case you're in a really difficult position. So I'd kind of, you've all worked with different skilled people, we've all worked with different firms. We won't name any firms because we'll hit the buzzer if we do. But certainly I've worked with 3 of the big 4, 3 who are outside of the big 4. And I would say all but one of those was pretty credible, all but 2 who won't name. But the 2 smaller firms, I think, found it really difficult because they're coming into an environment, particularly if they're dealing with a bank, where the bank's got very senior people and a very good legal team, and they make the skilled person's life difficult because there's a challenge. Whereas if you get a big four, particularly, a couple of the big four, they already come in with that kind of kudos of we're the big four. I know they've taken some bad press recently, but the old adage, no one ever got fired for hiring Deloitte, right? Stands up.
Yeah.
But they're all big four for a reason.
Yeah, they're all big four for a reason. So how do we feel about the skilled people that we've worked with? That was supposed to be a really good lead for us to say how nice skilled persons are.
Having been on I suppose in the example, one of the examples I've got, having been on the receiving end of the skilled person side, we've been facing off to them on behalf of the regulator. I suppose it's always difficult because I think there's a big caveat to this, is if you are in that enforcement, internally it is really challenging, really difficult. We'll probably come on to that in a little bit, but the skilled person that I was involved with was actually really good, really open to working with us, saying, right, actually, how do we do this collectively, develop the plans, develop the strategy and the approach and the timescales to actually get these things right, injecting an element of realism into it. We'll all been, not just as part of kind of collections and recoveries activity, but we've always been part of, any sort of transformation program that's kind of been at an exco level, as someone has said. These are the dates, right?
Yeah.
Okay, without actually that full kind of left to right planning process, and that's where, in my experience with some of the skilled person, they were really open to that. So it made a very difficult period and process and environment a lot more open in terms of being able to actually say, right, we know what we're here to do to kind of get the right outcome for the business and the customer to satisfy the regulator, so we can then just get on with BAU.
Yeah,
to be better free.
Yeah.
The best skilled persons I've experienced are those that don't want to hide anything. Me and you worked on one.
that sounds like it's going down a very dark.
No, I'm really casting my mind back here, but me and you worked on one, and we got challenged for not presenting the facts, that we were creating issues that weren't there, and blah. And it was a horrible time. It was really, really challenging. It really, really was.
That's an interesting one, right? So we can't name either firm involved, but that where we the one that we were referring to, we actually provided the skilled person with more insight on here's the issues. This is where we think that the root cause is. This is what we think they need to do to fix it. Here's the potential customer cohorts. Here's the detriment. And we were actually getting blocked, weren't we, by the SP at that point. It was going, this is, I think the theme was, this is our job and we don't need help doing it. Oh, and we don't think that's important. The regulators thought it was important in the end. So went full circle.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was an interesting example. That was a unique one. I don't think we've ever worked anywhere that's...
it's interesting how you brought that to life, because I think on the one I was involved in, it was definitely we led it in terms of this is what we think we should do, this is why we think we should do it, and they would almost rubber stamp it and give us that opportunity, that opportunity to challenge us on it, right before we go back and kind of confirm these plans and say, look, we're happy with them from a regulatory perspective. They'd act as that kind of challenge for us, that independent. You sure about that? You might want to do that a bit quicker. Have you thought about this component X, Y, and Z, whatever? So that's where it worked for us. It was us coming up with the solutions and how we were going to fix it, because ultimately it was our responsibility to fix it. Yeah. So.
I mean, we thought we'd handed it to them on a plate. All the self-identified issues.
trying to be good corporate citizens.
Completely. Done all the cohort analysis. What a past business review would look like, what the cost of it would look like, and funny that became the blueprint.
I think it goes back to what you said at the start. There's a clue in the title, skilled person, and I think where you worked with someone who genuinely is skilled in what they're trying to achieve and understand the subject matter really, really clearly, the outcome is always much better. Too often, I think I've seen very highly skilled individuals come in at a senior level, sell the program, if you like, and then once it's set up, you don't really see them again until the end. And the people who come in to actually deliver the program maybe has less experience, don't really understand it as much, work as analysts on lots of different programs, and they happen to be free at the time to come in and deliver. Where the people, with the true skill set and the experience come in and they stay in and they work with the firm in a partner type basis, then I think we see a much more interesting result, much better result in terms of the outcome for the firm.
Yeah.
And I also like it when again, seen different approaches where you kind of almost not allowed to get involved. This is what we want. This is the information we want. Send it to us. That's it. You don't hear anything back until the final report. Versus, well, actually, these are the ones we're going to be looking at. We'd like to work with your team. How would you look at it? How would we look at it? And then, that collaborative approach. And invariably, that's a much better result because there's a greater level of understanding on the part of the skilled person before they actually summarise their findings. So for me, I think that makes a good skilled person's report at the end, good skilled person's activity when they're working with you as a partner.
Thinking about people who might be watching this,
right?
In your experience, the skilled persons that work with you, to your point, we want to understand how your team's doing it. What would you do? Blah, blah. And the people who say, we want this on this day in this medium, and we're not going to talk to you about it. Do either of those methodologies impact the end result? So if you get the person who's cold and says, we want this, we're not talking to you, is it a fait accompli that you're done? You pretty much, you're on the rocks here. Is it irrelevant?
I don't think it's a fait accompli because I think if they are genuinely a skilled person and they will truly say what they see, then they're going to do that whether you've collaborated with them or not. So I would like to think that most people in our industry operate that way. So I don't think it's a fait accompli. But I think what does happen is that you'll get a version and then there'll be some more back and forth because there'll be assumptions made, statements made, conclusions drawn that aren't necessarily based on fact, and therefore there's we have to just do a bit of rework on this because that wasn't quite right, they haven't understood. So I think there's a risk it runs on longer, or there's a risk that certain things are said in certain environments, board meetings for example, and they become myth, becomes legend, becomes fact, and then suddenly that there's whole policies and processes being designed to deliver against things that are not based in truth. Whereas I think if you've got the partnership approach, you tend to avoid that. Because there's a level of understanding first. That doesn't, it's not a fait accompli the other way either, that you're going to get away with a glowing report, because actually they're asking for the facts first before they then present findings. So I think, if you're a good skilled person, it won't matter which way you go, to be honest. But I think the second one is a much more enjoyable way to work.
Less uncomfortable. That's more enjoyable. Let's talk about the cost. One of the things we've talked about in the past with a number of our customers, if you're considering organic enhancement or organic transformation of how you treat customers in financial difficulty, it's going to cost you money, right? If you want to engage us as a team to come in and share our experience, it's going to cost you money. If you want to engage one of the big four, it's going to cost you at least 10 times what we cost for less. But the reality is, if you're in a position where you don't invest and you don't make the changes, like we said at the start, you can't not know there's a significant body of work now that's gone in from the regulator that says you should be doing all these things or not doing these things, and you choose not to invest. In my opinion, if you reach the point where you're asked to instruct a skilled person by the FCA, your minimum cost is $1 million. Minimum cost. The skilled person might not necessarily cost you $1 million, depending on the size of the review. But I would work on the cost to your firm through a skilled person, effort and work, data, time, is a minimum $1 million before any remediation. The biggest that we've seen, what's a close run actually, but I would say 750 million is the biggest. That's total cost. That's skilled person, remediation, full technology, replatforming, blah, blah, blah.
Program.
And 4 or 5 years of your corporate world being disrupted. So it's easy to ignore enforcement, as in it won't happen to us. But it's more than just reputational damage. It's more than just you weren't doing the right thing for your customer. Particularly, thinking back to the one, which is very publicly known, so I'm not giving away any secrets here, but to be the first, to be a building society and be the first fined for poor treatment of customers really hurt them. Because it's culturally, it's not just reputationally.
Their members.
Yeah, it's not just reputationally. We're a building society. We're here to do the right thing for society, which they are a fantastic company. But to be told that actually your most vulnerable customers, the customers that really need your support the most, were the ones that you're really impacting the most negatively. And no, culturally, that hurt them. Really, really impacted them. And I think since then, I've seen that in different chunks and different businesses. But generally, there's always some reputational impact. There's always some cost impact. There's always a cultural impact, which I think would be worth us coming on to. But like, just from your own experiences, what was it like from the enforcement actions you guys have all been involved in? What's your own take on them? What did that change for you with the businesses you were working with?
I'll just go back to the cost bit just before that, if I may, because I think it's a really interesting thought that there is a short-term mindset, particularly, most firms, particularly in financial services at the moment, most firms are constantly challenging themselves on cost, and you see people taking people out of the business and substituting for automation where possible, which obviously makes sense. But in an environment where you're dealing person to person, particularly in something that's as complex as collections, for example, it does have risks. And so this short-term view of the cost of getting someone in to help and do the review and do the independent research and show us what we should be doing, there's a significant cost up front. But the cost associated with not doing that, you talked about skilled person might come in, you talked about remediation. Well, the sooner you do it, the less the remediation. So there's a saving there for that whole thing. But we haven't talked about the fines.
Yeah.
The associated fines. Now, if you look at the level of fines that have come out, just recently and even going back, there's not many of those fines that you'd pay in terms of upfront fees. So, there's a lot to think about in terms of the costs associated with it. Short-term gain, long-term pain, if not. Something to think about there.
The bit that people don't see, I always think the fines are interesting. So like, X firm was fined 4 million or 25 million or whatever it is. And people go, oh, that's a big number. That's just the fine. People don't see the remediation cost underneath. If you've had to pay back 100, 200, 300 million to customers, it's not just the fine. And we've all seen kind of the provision numbers going in for some of this enforcement action across the industry. It's eye-watering. If you've been being very naughty for a very long time, the cost is going to be eye-watering when it comes out.
I think, what was it? The most recent one is, I think it was 5 million fine with a discount baked in, and the actual remediation was close to 20.
That's huge.
Yep.
And that's not the biggest.
No.
It's not the biggest firm.
But it gives you an idea of the scale of just that cost.
Yeah.
That's the cost to them that they've had to pay out to the customer. That's not the actual how much does it cost me to run that program to deliver that.
Plus, then you can't. You've got to factor in that reputational cost. You've got to try and put a number on that somewhere.
Yeah.
Industry to industry, it might differ, but I've no doubt. I haven't got a number, but no doubt the YBS one would have cost them reputationally as a pounds number, because people would have been turned off and moved off and gone to another provider for a period until they'd corrected that. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and we're kind of touching on it now, is culture. And I think there's a number of lenses here for me. Generally, this is a very sweeping statement, but generally, firms with the best culture, I believe, are the best at avoiding enforcement action. Statement. We'll come on to discuss that. Those firms who are put into enforcement action and have a bad culture, the culture consumes the firm. That's my experience. I'm not asking you guys to agree with that, but it's been very clear to me. So I talked about as an example. The culture of that business helped them go from being on the kind of in the enforcement pot to being off the watch list in 12 months. They took it so seriously and approached it so diligently and to the book that they transformed how they operated within 12 months. Let's say 18 months, you've gone from, really unfair outcomes to almost none. Then you look at other firms who have maybe been in an enforcement process for 4, 5, 6 years. The cultural bit can tear you apart, tear your own teams apart.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in very recent examples where, you're trying to take a leadership team in a direction of understanding, but there's so many vested interests and so many people whose jobs are on the line and so many material risk takers or SMFs that nobody wants to pull together and say, look, we own this as a group, we've done it, we're all in it together and we'll all fix it together. So be interested in your take on how does culture play a part in this, both before and after enforcement? What have you seen? What's your experiences?
So I think I completely agree. If you've got the right culture, generally most things go quite well.
Yeah.
And I think a good example in this space would be the right culture would be very proactively raising issues with the regulator. Every financial services firm has regular communication with their supervisory team. Being open and honest and taking problems to them and showing what you're doing with those problems, I find goes a very long way. And it gives you that bit of breathing space to put things in place and fix. If they see proactivity, if they see you have a culture of trying to fix things, finding problems, risk-based cohorts is a really good example. Going and looking for things, when the general stuff is going well all the time, going and looking for things that might not be, to show that you're really serious about delivering good outcomes to all segments of customers. I think that goes a very long way. And therefore, if you do find yourself in problems, typically the relationship with the regulator will be such that they'll give you that bit of extra breathing space, that bit of time, and maybe even, delay any kind of enforcement action, gives you an opportunity to put it right.
Yep.
If you're not in that space and something is found through their own supervisory action, that's when it becomes a bit more challenging. So I completely agree.
Or worse, you know that it's there and actively don't disclose it, which is the worst of all worlds, which we've all seen in various capacities.
That's the worst of the worst.
It's the worst of the worst. You knew it was there and you knew it was bad and you didn't do anything about it.
I think when by the virtue of the fact that the regulators come in and found it, there's that insinuation of, if we found it, and like you said, there's no secret formula to this. If we found it and you haven't, that's even more damning because it's there. How have you not found it?
Well, you can't win that, can you? Because they can say either your monitoring teams are incompetent, because they haven't found it, or you did know and you purposefully not disclosed it.
And that's the insinuation.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff.
So you're on the back foot straight away then. So then every time you bring a plan, it's not considered credible. Yep. I think it's one of the most critical areas for me. And I'd never, probably for the first 5 or 6 years of working in this space, hadn't appreciated the impact of culture, both pre and post. And it's only kind of now looking at kind of the organisations we work with now, some of whom are amazing, got brilliant cultures, they want to do the right thing for the customer, particularly the younger businesses that are coming through. And they're mortified. If you find something now where you say, actually, you shouldn't be doing this because this and this firm have already been sanctioned for it, and generally you get an immediate response.
Yeah.
Like, it's an immediate, we don't want to be that firm. That's not us. We want to do the right thing. Very rare do we get the kind of blocking, obfuscation, procrastination to do stuff. The cultural component is so important. And I do mean that wholeheartedly. What's the first action that happens? Think about where we've all been in the past, right? Generally, the firms that are trying to defend, right? So rather than, okay, we've spotted it, we were blind to this, but now we know we want to fix it, right? Ignore that. The firms who say, no, we don't do that. Generally, you could almost predict the series of actions, right? The director or MD of that area will no doubt leave to pursue his erstwhile interests in skiing or
in the garden,
whatever it is.
More time with the family.
Well, more time with the family, right? So it's like a playbook. Then they'll bring in somebody who's seen as a big hitter, as like a kick the doors down type person. Has some success for a period because it's all speed and pace and fact. Then you reach the point where the operational teams are saying this is either going too quick or we don't understand this, or there's too much change, and you hit that change fatigue piece. You can almost go through the playbook of what happens in a bad example of this stuff. But the biggest thing is the minute your team's on the ground start relaying upwards, we don't agree with this, or we don't understand, or there's a lack of transparency from top to bottom, I think is where the problems start. because we're all adults and we all work in the same environment. There's naturally going to be a degree of need to know whilst enforcement action's going on. It's always going to happen because of all the impact we talked about. But once that enforcement is known and a firm or an entity are in it and there's action plans, there's no reason not to be transparent about that, because it's going to come out anyway. It's like in politics, you can't keep anything a secret. It's going to come out. Isn't it better to come out
sooner,
a managed, we're taking these steps, we're doing this, we want to be proactive, than we didn't say anything, we didn't disclose it, just Brian decided he was off and wasn't ever coming back, and then all of a sudden we closed this site,
we've self-identified, here's our plan, this is where we need to get to, this is what we're going to fix.
Because you get buy-in from your own people. Because often the people, and I don't mean the people are a problem, how people have been trained, how people have been positioned, maybe what they're being asked to do, that is the end cause. So if you're a vulnerable customer and you're talking to somebody who doesn't know what vulnerability is, has never used Texas or has never been on any kind of training, they're not going to identify vulnerability unless they're particularly empathetic and they pick up on it and they naturally act on it. So keeping your kind of frontline population away from what's actually happening never ends well, I don't think. The more you can involve them and engage them and take them on the journey, as one of the things that I referenced about their program. One of the things they did is take the staff population with them from day one. Yeah. So this has happened. It's terrible. It's not us. This isn't who we are. Here's our playbook of how to fix this. Here's how we're going to do it. We want your help along the way. So they took them on the journey right from the start, and it was probably one of the factors that led to that success. But not everybody does that. You still get the shrouded in mystery, who knows what, who can tell who what, and then it all gets really confusing. I've waffled a bit there.
Yeah.
Rambled on a little bit.
There's an element in that, I suppose, in the cultural piece, and without naming names, there's...
Name the names.
No,
go on, name them.
Size and scale, I think, makes a massive difference from a cultural point of view. So think about some of the larger banks and where they've been in terms of the number of different kind of operating centres, sites, brands, systems that they're going to have to change. That is a long, complex, or can be a long, complex process and change program to deliver that. And I think it can be, being on the inside of some of those, you can see the challenges that they have in terms of how do we nail the culture whilst also delivering at pace, because we've got to do it, because we've committed to do it. So I can see you can be between a rock and a hard place, but ultimately, like you say, if you're in that position where the regulator already in, the skilled person is already in, then you that ship has already sailed. But it's how do you then make the best of it in terms of that situation. So you do see firms trying to do the right thing, but recognising the size, the scale, the complexity of this means I've got to move at pace.
Yeah.
So I therefore cannot take everyone on the journey that I'd like to do.
You two are very quiet over there.
No, I was just thinking about a smaller firm that we worked with last year. So quite a small organisation, but they were on two journeys. They were on a cultural transformation as well as an operational transformation. And, it was a small but really successful piece of work because, that cultural buy-in was there and the commitment to change was there. And I think it's that recognition of the commitment to change and the change that is required. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but the commitment and the acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Not the denial.
Makes sense.
There's probably a broad point in all of this, isn't there? Just how long it can take to actually, put the forward fix in place to stop all of this, but also then the turnaround of that, including the remediation, any cultural challenges that we talked about. It can take a long time. I really, you're talking years, effectively, aren't you?
It depends who you've got on the pitch, though, doesn't it? And how big the problems are.
That can influence it, yeah. But I think in terms of if we said, right, if you were a firm and you've been subject to a skilled person, or you're involved and you say, right, I'm going to have this fixed, my policies are going to be changed, and I'm a training in place, put processes, standards, monitoring frameworks all up and running in 12 months. You've then still probably got another 12 to 18 months at least of embedding all of the calibration between your first and second lines, the refining, the tweaking of what you're doing and why, establishing the narrative, the reporting, all the way up. But all of those things are going to take a long time.
It's 4 years minimum for a big firm.
Yeah.
Minimum 4 years.
I think it also helps to bring not just keep colleagues posted all the way along the line of what you're doing, but actually bring them in and help them decide what you're going to be doing. Because the number of times I've seen policies and processes been rolled out, and the first time anybody in the front line knows about them is when they're going on a training course, and then somebody sits there and says, well, this doesn't work because you can't do that on this system, you can't press this button. It's like, oh, and great, it's all these change experts who probably are very, very good at change and system development, haven't actually checked with the front line to see what the requirements are.
And nobody knows better than the front line.
Well, exactly. And they speak with customers day in, day out all the time. They understand the challenges. They understand what's difficult with speaking to a customer at the same time as using a system. So they're the perfect people to bring along and bring in, have the forums and make sure they're engaged at all of the different stages. I think that certainly helps the embedding process, shortens it significantly.
We did that really well last year, didn't we? Do you remember working for a certain client? We had a war room and we posted all the policies up around the walls, all the new standards, all the letters, invited all the colleagues in, scheduled, or they could just walk in when they wanted, put post-it notes on. And like you just said, they know what will work, what won't work. And the amount of little nuggets we got on our post-it notes were brilliant.
Can't do this because pulls it out.
Yeah. And we did that before we went into a period of training. So they'd started on that journey. The scene had been set before they started on the training sessions.
Makes life
so it was
easier.
good.
Last couple of points I thought would be worth teasing out. One is remediation programs, because we've not talked about that. So the bit that people maybe don't see, and we touched on the financial amount, is the effort to remediate. Generally, there's no smoke without fire. If you've been fined or you've had a final notice or an intervention, you're going to have to do some kind of redress.
Yep.
That could be process redress, so working with the customer to put them back in the position they should have been in the first place. It could be detriment redress or harm, so maybe you've impacted credit files that you need to go and put right. Maybe you've charged the customer fees or interest that you need to go and refund. Generally, there's some kind of D&I payment on top of that, or a general kind of cost. There's the cost of a remediation team, because you're probably not going to have one of them sitting around, and you're going to need to bring one in. So it's not just as simple as we've had an FCA enforcement visit, we've had a skilled person, we've had a report. There's then a huge program of work to put it right. So just tell us about your experience. You've all worked on various programs. What was the size, the shape, the task for those kind of teams?
They vary. I think the smallest I was on probably was about, in total, 50. And then the largest, including actual people doing the dishing out the redress, 1,000.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to anyone who's been around the industry during the PPI era may well have been involved in significant, well above the sorts of numbers that we would typically see.
Yeah.
And actually, when you get into that sort of scale, it becomes a whole different ball game anyway. But certainly, some of the smaller ones can be quite challenging. You mentioned 50. If you've got a very small cohort of people, perhaps the same level of rigor doesn't go into those as you might see with a bigger program. And I've even seen some examples where the remediation program is delivered by the business team, and almost to the point where it's delivered, then when you come to do the monitoring and the testing, the assurance on it, you find actually it's not fixed the issue, or it's delivered some other level of unfairness, or they haven't thought about something. So I think if you're putting a program together, getting all of the key stakeholders around the table to design a program that is definitely fit for purpose and meets the customer needs, it is crucial, because it's a really easy mistake to make. So you can understand how sometimes through, with hindsight, things change and you find you've delivered some unfair outcomes on a journey that was perhaps created 10 years ago that perhaps isn't as fit for purpose as it used to be. It's unforgivable to remediate that journey and then find you've got that wrong as well.
Well, look how many times you've had to remediate the remediation.
Which is amazing, isn't it? It does happen a lot. What about you, mate?
I think from my experience of seeing the ones I've been involved in, they have been deployed as a program, and they've typically followed the firm's internal change methodology. So a lot of that then is a lot of it then falls out to, is your internal change methodology actually any good? And actually, in terms of the ability to mobilise a programme, going back to the cost, the time scales, right, I need to go through various gateways to kind of get the right people involved, get the right budget, the costing. That tends to be, and I've generally seen them go through that approach. What that does is create a bit of a lag in terms of mobilising that programme. What I've seen in the interim is where they pull resource SMEs. Everyone loves an SME on a programme, don't they? Usually the same SME who's involved in lots of different programmes.
It's usually the same SME who caused it.
Probably, yeah, it probably is, yeah. But they're the right person to fix it.
No.
But you tend to find that they're drawn from the operational resource, then has a less visible cost on the operation.
Yeah.
Because you always go for the best people, don't you? You pull out the best people, the SMEs, the most experienced, and they're the ones who tend to be pulled out to kind of support, whilst a more strategic, fully costed program is being mobilised. And then what you end up being is your workaround isn't your workaround, it's your long-term strategy there. So there's always a wider operational cost in these for me that's kind of not visible. And it goes back to those hidden costs of being in this scenario. Yeah.
Sometimes, though, a SME can get confused with a SME can get confused with the person who's been there the longest.
Yeah.
And I've been on programs where that's caused delays in remediation.
We could probably spend another 2 hours talking about SMEs or SMEs. Couldn't
Yeah, SMEs.
There's definitely a delivery video.
Yeah.
Because we're talking in the round about enforcement, but there's 100% how do you structure a good delivery program, because we've seen the really good ones and we've seen the really bad ones. So it'd be good to maybe do that at a later date. Is there anything you think we've missed that's critical to talk about?
I think the one bit I think we haven't quite brought to light, or we kind of have implicitly, but they're just horrible situations to be in when you're in that eye of the storm in terms of an enforcement notice or some sort of regulatory enforcement. Being on the receiving end of it is not fun at all. It's stressful, it's challenging, can bring out the worst in people. Yeah. As well, from a purely people perspective, it's a really challenging time, and that's exacerbated at an organisational level as well. Corporate, all your governance, your structures, everything that works well in a time of peace, for want of a better phrase, is really put to the test. All your governance models, your behaviour, your culture, it's all tested through that, and it can be a really challenging time.
Yeah, your regulatory reportable milestone dates always used to be.
Everything becomes very strange.
Yeah.
Yes, that becomes very strange. So if you are watching this and you're a CEO or a CO or a CRO who's teaching on this, we feel your pain. I never knew you were that articulate. It was really nice. Keep that.
It's really stressful. I'm only 25.
Brilliant.